Welcome to My Money, Your Money, a weekly talk show on generational wealth, wealth management, and personal finance, and more. Now introducing your host, Miss Brigette Lumpkins.
Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to My Money, Your Money, brought to you by DeMesman and Dover Accident Attorneys. I'm your host, Brigette Lumpkins, and I'm so glad you are here to talk about all things personal finance and wealth generation. I'm currently an executive at a digital asset management firm here in Miami. I earned my MBA at Wharton and have held various roles on Wall Street at firms like Lehman and Goldman Sachs. And I'm passionate about helping our community get access and knowledge to build wealth. We're joined today by our guest, Tony Rogers, a fourth-generation Floridian whose family roots in the state date back to the late 1800s in Madison County. Tony followed a bachelor's degree at Bethune-Cookman with a law degree from The Ohio State University. Now an author, attorney, and investment advisor, we are so fortunate to have him here with us tonight to share insights related to his book, On the Road to the Promised Land. Tony, welcome.
Bridget, thank you so much. I would like to first express my appreciation for this kind of conversation. And I'm very excited to be here and very excited to share with you more about the book.
Oh, we're thrilled to have you. And, I was reviewing the talking points, about your book. I haven't had a chance to read it yet. But you talk about the wealth gap of African Americans compared to other populations in this country. Can you tell us a bit more about your approach to that question in this book?
Yeah, I think that's a powerful question indeed. I was listening to you earlier and your emphasis on the wealth gap. The wealth gap is something that has been, I think it has been talked about for generations, but what is happening now is we can find, it seems that there's a greater emphasis, particularly by government, as we talk more about issues such as reparations. Much of that focus is on how do we close the wealth gap. And so what I try to do in the book, Bridget, is I try to, first of all, take a historical perspective of how do we get here? Because sometimes we get recommendations for Black Americans to do certain things, but it's offered in a vacuum. And we don't really say, well, how did we get here? How did we get such a wealth gap? Why hasn't it been able to get closed? So in addition to trying to offer some solutions, I think practical solutions on how to close the wealth gap, I also take a retrospective view and say, this is how we got here. Part of that is to help us understand what was done to us, not just what was done by us.
Right. So I really want to talk more about your perspective, but I also think we say wealth gap and a lot of people can't quantify that. And even if you quantify it, you can't visualize it. So I think we have a graphic here that we're going to put up that quantifies and visualizes the wealth gap in a way that's very powerful for our viewers to relate to before we go into the conversation about how we got here and how we corrected. So I think we have that available now if we can see that. Okay, so can you talk us through this image?
Yeah, and great point, Bridget. First of all, let me just define wealth, because sometimes we think that the word wealth is synonymous with wealthy, not necessarily. Mm-hmm. The word wealth is very simple. It means net worth. So what does that mean? It means that if I take everything I own, all the assets that I have, and I liquidate those, I sell those, and then I pay off all my debts and obligations, what do I have left? That's called net worth, and it's the same as wealth. So what you're looking at, quite frankly, this is the most recent measure of average household net worth, and it's done by ethnic group. It's a demographic profile. So obviously, if you look at white Americans, the average net worth of white Americans was about $171,000, all races combined, close to $100,000. But when you look at Black Americans, it was $17,000. Now, let me also emphasize, this was done prior to the pandemic.
Right. And so when we were talking earlier, you mentioned that the pandemic has been especially hard on Black families and Black net worth. Can you talk about that a little bit before we go back and talk about the historical context that created this disparity?
Absolutely, Bridget, and I think it's a very important point you bring up. You see, one of the big challenges we have, it is somewhat historical, but basically, if you look at Black Americans as homeowners, that's where most of the wealth is generated for most Americans. And so we really lag behind. Now, there are a number of reasons. You could say, housing discrimination, whatever the case may be. It's interesting. I had a conversation with one of my cousins who lives in New York. He lives in Brooklyn. And he said, well, we tend to be renters. Well, you can't build wealth if you're a renter. So because we are not proportionately landowners, homeowners, but much more renters, you can't build net worth that way. And so now if you take what happened for instance, in New York, where you've got people who are renters and where we're relying on our labor. And so what happens? Unemployment goes up. We can't even meet our rent. We had the challenge where people were not even able to pay rent. And in addition to that, we were on the front line of much of the pandemic when you look at emergency services. So there are a lot of ways we got hurt beyond just the economic component. But you're right, we did get hurt badly by it.
Well, when you talk about the historical context, and I really want to get to that part because I have a good friend who studies gentrification. In fact, she's working on a major research project in gentrification in DC, which is my hometown. And that city has been really hit by a wave of gentrification. I say hit because it's leaving Black people out. When you talk about home ownership, even if you're a homeowner, you may not build the same amount of wealth as a white person who owns a similar home because of housing price discrimination.
Exactly.
Right. So your house isn't going to appreciate and you're not going to have that equity to leverage to create opportunities for your family.
Right.
To create more equity. But I want you to walk me through, especially from the perspective of your book, the historical context for this stark reality, because we're talking 10%. I mean, in 2016, the average white family had $171,000 plus in net worth compared to 17,000, but not 17,900, barely 17,000 for Black family. So that's 10%. That's shocking. How did we end up here?
Yeah, great question, Bridget. The reality is we got here in 1865 when William Sherman, marched to the sea. So for those of you all who saw Gone with the Wind, that's what that movie was about. It was about when the Union Army was marching through Atlanta, burned Atlanta to the ground, and marched to Savannah, Georgia. And so when they arrived at Savannah, Georgia, William Sherman, he met with 20 Black preachers, 20 former slaves. And the spokesperson was a man by the name of Garrison Frazier. And so the government, now bear in mind, the government representative asked Garrison Frazier, who was the spokesman for this group, what can the government do? You all were loyal to us during the war. You fought with us as soldiers in contraband. So now what can the government do to compensate you for being loyal? What can we do to make sure that you can take care of yourselves? And Garrison Frazier said land. And he said, if we had land, not only would we be able to take care of ourselves, but we will have something extra. The something extra is what we call net worth or wealth. So imagine this, in 1865, we knew where wealth was created. Now, of course, that was where the story about the 40 acres came from, which is what happened. 400,000 acres on the East Coast from South Carolina down to Jacksonville was subdivided into 40 acres and given to families to work. But then, of course, we know Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. Andrew Johnson, a Southerner, replaced him, and then through Reconstruction took the land back. But the point is we knew in the very beginning an asset like land would give us economic independence. So that's the historical context.
Okay, so I have a question for you, and it's going to push back on your hypothesis and your thesis a little bit, but I know you can take it. So land, that was 1865. It's 2021. We have a tech-enabled economy. We have digital assets. We have a much more sophisticated economy now than we did then. It's not an agrarian society anymore. So is land, how and why is land still the key to building net worth in 2021?
Yeah, if it is still very important. In fact, if you take, for instance, let's just take Miami. Miami now is rated as the second most expensive place to live in the country, only behind Los Angeles. I'm sorry, only behind New York. We passed Los Angeles. And that just came out last week. And so here's the first thing. If you cannot afford to live anywhere near your place of employment, you are automatically economically displaced.
Yeah.
And let's take, for instance, Miami, where the average house in Miami is $500,000. That is the median price. And so what you end up with, and let's just talk about what you just said in Washington, D.C. But you end up now with people who literally almost have to live 60 miles away from their job. And so if you look at the income disparity, tell me how I, on $35,000 to $40,000, am supposed to find livable circumstances where the average home price is $500,000. So we can't even bridge that gap. Now, if you say rent, okay, great. Miami's average rents, anybody will tell you, are almost unattainable.
Oh, I can tell you. I can tell you because I live here. I can tell you all about it. Yeah.
Yeah, we've got to be able to stabilize our economic circumstances before we can capitalize on the opportunities.
Yeah. I couldn't agree with you more. This is the reality of my daily life. And I'm not in that income bracket where, you know, it's unattainable, but it certainly is a stretch and it's a challenge. And if someone like me can be challenged by that environment, I can only imagine the people who work at the Target in my neighborhood, for example.
Spot on.
Yeah. How are they supposed to get to work? And they're getting paid, you know, well for their job. At least.
And see, you come from DC, where there's an excellent mass transit system. We don't have that here. We don't have a mass transit system that can get people. You know, listen, I have cousins that lived in New York City, never learned how to drive until they were in their 40s and moved to Florida. They didn't need to. They just took mass transit. At one point, I was working in Manhattan. I could commute from Pennsylvania to Manhattan every day. Can't do that in South Florida.
No, you cannot. I mean, things are looking better with the Bright Line and other things, but the Bright Line is actually quite expensive. So it's not necessarily going to be accessible to people. In that situation. So tell me more. I know you have the 25-25 plan, right? And maybe you can relate this to where we are today in 2021, 5 years after the chart that we saw, and what that's about.
Yeah, thank you, Bridget. So here's the first thing. I think that what I don't want to do is for us to get frustrated. But I think it's important that we make incremental progress. When you make any progress incrementally, you start to feel better. You start to believe that you can. And I will say the first thing in my world of building wealth is mindset. The mindset is the most important ingredient in terms of building positive net worth and succeeding. So what I do is suggest incremental progress. Now, what does that mean? So I'm suggesting that the average African-American increase your household net worth $2,000 per year net over the next 5 years. That would increase our average net worth to a total of about $25,000 per household. So therein lies the acronym 25-25 plan. By the year 2025, the idea is to get our average net worth to $25,000 per household. Now, that might not sound like a lot, but let me tell you what it translates to. It translates to about $600 to $700 billion of additional wealth for the Black community. $600 to $700 billion. That stabilizes homes and it stabilizes our key institutions, which rely on us. So even though that sounds like a small thing to do, the average net worth increasing $2,000 per household, it has a powerful overall effect on our community.
So how do we do that though? Because if you're insisting, if you make $15 an hour at Target and you're paying all this money in gas and transportation costs because you've got to commute from 30 miles away to get there, and that's like your opportunity set, how do you increase your net worth by $2,000 every year? Yeah,
it's a great question. You know, sometimes I say the answer is not to ride the bike faster, is to get a better bike. You know, if I got a 3-speed bike, it's only so fast that bike's going to go. So I got to go get me a 10-speed to figure out how to do that. Now, listen, let's be honest. In some cases, the first thing is I believe very strongly in tools such as a household budget. And by the way, I have been in the financial services business for 31 years. I've been in a lot of African-American homes. And when I ask, does anybody have a budget? you would be surprised at how few do. And that may sound like a very simple thing, but I tell people all the time, if you don't have a household budget, that's like flying an airplane from here to New York and you have no fuel gauge. You have no idea if you can get there or where you're going to land. So you need to have that. And then when you have the household budget, that is called being accountable for what I do get in my hands. Now, does that mean I may have to find a way to get additional revenue on a short-term basis so I can pay down bills and try to get myself in a position where I have any kind of disposable, positive cash flow? And when I say that, when I do my budget, even if I have $50 left over per month, that is a start. I can now look at $10 or $20 and put that away. That contributes towards where we're trying to go. So the first thing is to be honest. Start with a budget. Be accountable for what you have. And then, as I said, in some cases, you might be riding a 3-speed bike. You may have to get a 10-speed. What does that mean? That means that I may have to find some additional revenue. I'm not saying a lot, but maybe I've got to find an extra $20, $30, $50 per month that I will contribute towards building my net worth. And that's the starting point.
Okay. It's funny that you mentioned a budget because we had a certified financial planner on last week who mentioned the same thing as a foundational tool to wrapping your arms around your financial situation and accelerating and improving your situation there. Now, I want to go back to, we know what happened to us, right? I think it's fairly clear we got robbed after Reconstruction, right? We got robbed during Reconstruction and haven't been able to catch up. Disparities in home price appreciation. So the same house bought in 1920 by a white family on different sides of the track did not create wealth generating opportunities for the Black family who bought it versus the white family. We know that. We know about redlining and getting locked out of all of that stuff. I think that stuff is really common knowledge. But what have we done aside from not having a budget? Because I do think that if you're subsisting, it's hard to have a budget.
Yes.
Right? It's psychologically hard, and it can be logistically hard because you're always blowing the budget because you don't have enough.
Well,
so
it's
what
a wonderful
have we done? What can we do better aside from the budget?
Yeah, it's a wonderful point you're making. You're absolutely right, actually. But see, I get back to the mindset. A lot of people I work with don't even want to do the budget because they say, I know it's going to be bad. I don't even want to look at it.
Right.
And so you got to change that mindset. You have to. Now, beyond that, Bridget, here's what I genuinely believe. I genuinely believe that if we as Black Americans were to do exactly what Martin Luther King said in Memphis, we could get to that point. Now, what did he say? What he said is we needed to be more accountable with and for each other. Black Americans operate in silos. Now, what do I mean by that? And I work with this all the time. I may have something going on. I'm not going to share that idea with you. I'm not going to share the information with you. That's why I wrote the book. I mean, listen, I didn't need to write the book. Sometimes I say to people, the book may not apply to a lot of my friends who are doing well. But the point is, as a group of people, watch this, and I talk about this in the book, virtually every other ethnic group has a micro economy but us. I can prove it. I can prove it. If you take certain ethnic groups, a dollar will pass through that community 7 times before it leaves. In our community, it lasts for 12 hours.
Wow.
And so one of the things Martin Luther King talked about is how do we collectively come together? If we've got people that are struggling the way you're saying, there are other people in our community that have the answer. We don't share answers. We don't come together. We can talk about anything but money. I put that in the book. We can talk about anything but money. We can talk about cards. We can talk about sports. We can talk about anything except that. And that has to change. It has to change where we become more engaged.
Right. I mean, I agree with you. Kanye West said the same thing actually in one of his lyrics about sharing that knowledge and supporting the community and sort of that sort of circulation of dollars, but most importantly, sharing knowledge about about how to make money, how to keep money, how to get access. And I want to talk about the political environment a little bit and how you think that has helped or hurt our effort as a community to be more cohesive and to support each other in building wealth or sharing information. Obviously, in 2016, we saw the election of Donald Trump to the presidency, but in 2020, we saw even more Black people voting for Trump than we did in 2016. How do you think that relates to this environment? Do you think that there was a what do you think that's about?
Well, Bridget,
it's nothing he was doing was really
no, you're hitting on some heavy stuff. You're right. You're all over it. Let me just tell you why. Because there's a Pew Research study that shows the following: Black women did not move away from the Democratic Party. Black men did. Mm-hmm. The number of Black men voting Democrat declined, and it didn't start in the last election. It actually dropped from 2008 to 2016 when President Obama was in office. Black men.
Right. I'm aware of that.
Black women have been consistent in their support and engaging in terms of politics with the Democratic Party. But here's the problem. There's a wonderful article that I cite in the book. Black men cited economics. And here's what they said. Black men said, we believe both parties are racist, but Donald Trump is at least talking about economics. That was their response. And so this divergence and dichotomy now of Black men and Black women is centered around economics. Black men are saying, we want to talk about economics. I mean, if you think about this thing, was it Ice Cube, the Platinum Plan? I don't know if you heard about that.
I did.
But what was that about? Okay, I got a plan. I'm going to go negotiate with the Trump organization purely on economics. And so we need to be aware when you talk about politics, that's the first sort of wedge that is taking place even in our own community. But here's the other thing. I'm not convinced, Bridget, by anything I've read that you can build sustainable net worth through politics. It's never happened. It's never happened.
No, I think, you really need just a framework, but it's business that creates that.
I think they can partner with us.
Yeah.
And I think, when we ask Black people to go out and vote and sacrifice, what we should be doing is saying to every politician, the number one issue in the Black community is the Black-white wealth gap. Tell me how your political platform is going to help. Now, okay, there were some things that were done that are very, very positive, because Kamala Harris proposed when she was running $100 billion for housing for African Americans. Actually, that was passed on Juneteenth. The actual day of Juneteenth is when it wasn't legislation, it was an executive order where the president did set aside money for affordable housing, and they put money into CDFIs, which are community banks. So they are putting money into the community, but that needs to be our number one talking point when we're talking politics. How are you going to partner with us to get my household net worth up to $25,000?
Okay. And tell me more, what other themes from your book do you think are really important takeaways for our audience today, and things that they can do today? I'm sure there's somebody who's soaking this up and really wants to increase their net worth by that $6,000 over the next 3 years. So,
well, what I would love to see, I think that here's something that concerns me to some degree, and I would love to see this change a little bit. We're finding a disengagement in our churches by the millennials. The millennials are not as engaged. And that's something we need to pay attention to, because quite frankly, when you read the book, you will see that the one institution that has been the most impactful in our community is the church. In fact, insurance companies came out of the church, banks came out of the church. So there's a disengagement going on that we need to figure out how to get back and bring that talent back into the church, partner with the church and say, okay, now watch, the people that we're trying to reach, the grassroots folks, where we can have a repository of knowledge, where we can have a think tank. The church is positioned where it can do that. And I'm saying from an economic standpoint, this is something that W.B. Du Bois talked about, E. Franklin Frazier talked about that. All of them talked about the fact that our Black church needs to be the anchor economically as well as spiritually. And I would love to see that begin to change, where we partner with our churches.
Yeah, well, younger Americans are less engaged religiously across the board, across ethnic groups. And there are lots of reasons for that. And frankly, Black churches tend to be very conservative and not aligned at all politically with the values of younger people. Gen Z is not, is very progressive, and Black churches are not. So there's a disconnect there. What do churches need to do to be more inclusive of people or is there another institutional construct that can include and embrace younger people and their values to encourage, to empower that economic foundation, to reignite that?
What we're seeing today, Brigette, are actually grassroots organizations popping up that are addressing it. If you look at Black Lives Matter, that did not start in the church. It didn't used to be that way.
Right.
But now what you're finding to be more impactful in the community are social grassroots organizations popping up. But what I'm trying to do is say, let's look at what resources we have. If we look at our HBCUs, why don't we have a think tank? Let me give you one example. Black Americans lose in the millions of acres every single year through something called heirs property. What's heirs property? Your forefathers had land. Rather than having it titled properly, they just wrote on it and passed it on. Mm-hmm. So now developers come along and snatch it up. Why don't we have a think tank in our HBCUs to say, wait a minute, we need to stop that. We need to be able to, because by the way, the other big area where we don't close the wealth gap is through inheritance. We lose our inheritance. We don't get a chance to pass it on. So let's look at our HBCUs. I get your point about the church, but we also have some grassroots organizations out there that, in my opinion, need to embrace the economic message of moving the needle for Black wealth.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, a lot of our activism is focused on survival. If you look at Abraham Maslow's needs hierarchy, that's about safety.
Yes.
Right. And we can't even think about money if we can't breathe.
Yes.
So the fact is that, that is with good cause and rationally so.
Yes.
The focus of our grassroots organizations, and only until we feel, I think, collectively some security, I think, can our collective energy be directed toward our economic empowerment, even though we all feel it acutely, even those of us who are middle class or ascending, still that wealth gap from the inheritance we're not getting to give us the leg up.
That's exactly right. I mean, even if you look at so-called upper middle class African Americans, when it comes to comparable net worth, we don't have it. And quite frankly, many times we are starting out from scratch. We didn't inherit anything. We had to find a way to build it, which makes us
giving it back.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And so I think that is a distinction from the average, sort of white middle class American or our classmates at our fancy schools or colleagues at our fancy jobs.
Yes.
That are. I want to say a little bit more about HBCUs because that's near and dear to my heart. I'm an HBCU graduate. I went to Spelman myself. And I believe very strongly, and my mom went to Howard. So, we're an HBCU family around my way and their role in this conversation. If you can talk about what you say in your book about STEM graduates and the role of HBCUs and Black economic empowerment.
Well, so here's the first thing, and I'm an HBCU grad myself, as are my children. My son graduated from Morehouse. I have a daughter who graduated from Hampton. So we are steeped in that tradition. And by the way, here's something that I think people need to know. Howard University, is that your alma mater? Is that correct?
No, I went to Spelman. My mother went to Howard.
Spelman. Okay. Well, here's something your mom can be particularly proud of. Howard University produces more STEM PhDs than the entire Ivy League combined, African American.
That doesn't surprise me at all, though, because being a native Washingtonian, we know that. But I think a lot of people don't know that. And I remember when I was in high school, and I told my Black guidance counselor that I was going to Spelman instead of the other schools I'd gone to, which was a nice list. She was very disappointed. And recently I've heard, especially immigrant Black people, doubt the value that HBCUs bring. And in the last year and a half or so, people have reconsidered that. So there's this renaissance, right? And money pouring into them and students pouring in. And so. Yeah.
No, I have in the book a quote you'll see, which is very interesting. Spelman College actually is number 1 in the state of Georgia for employment placement, and that means it includes Georgia Tech and Emory University.
You mean Black women?
Well, I mean, just if they look at overall job placement.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Yeah, you'll see that. By the way, this was conducted by several search employment firms. Spelman was number one, period. But now, see, you have a dichotomy, okay? Because if you look at there have been hundreds of millions of dollars that are being given out. And so, as the president of Howard University said recently in an article, he pointed out that there is a dichotomy that when you look at wealthy white people, and I think it's not Gates, but Jeff Bezos' ex-wife gave $100 million to HBCUs.
Yes, she did.
But they're very specific about who they give it to. Now, Spelman's at the top of the list. Howard's at the top of the list. Morehouse is at the top of the list. But at the bottom of the list of people who receive money, you now have an interesting discussion going on. For instance, when I was going to Bethune-Cookman, one of the schools we played was Albany State University. They've merged. And that is a trend that's taking shape throughout this country. A lot of HBCUs now are looking at merging in order to survive. And they're not merging with other Black schools. And so the head of the Thurgood Marshall Fund has suggested that HBCUs who need to merge need to look at consolidating with each other. That's been a nasty word in our community when we talk about consolidation. But you see, Spelman doesn't need to do that. Morehouse doesn't need to do that. Florida A&M doesn't need to do that. They are producing STEM graduates and they're competing with anybody. And by the way, when you look at technology, any technological company out there, they're going to go to HBCUs first. But we need to be aware. But we do need to be aware of that dichotomy to make sure. And so I propose in there again a think tank. We need to have a think tank of these HBCUs like Spelman, Howard, Hampton, Tuskegee, a think tank to say, hey, how should we proceed? Here's one thing, Bridget, before we sign off, I want to say this. And you hit on this really good point, but I also want to interject this. Because of what you said, while we're so frequently looking at sustainability from day to day, we end up not taking strategic steps. So we don't end up looking 5 years ahead and say, where should we be in 5 years? Do you know the major companies are doing that for 10 and 20 years ahead?
Yes.
And we end up saying, how are we going to make it through this week? Somehow we've got to find a way to have a conversation to say, let's look 5 years out. That's why I did the 2025, because we have to find a way to start thinking strategically. Even if it's still short term, I'm thinking about what happens tomorrow.
Okay. Now, we have a question from our audience, but before we get to that, it's impossible to be strategic when you're stuck being taxed.
Yes.
When you are hungry, you cannot think about those things. But our guest Russell asked us, is debt a big problem for Black families? And can you touch on that a bit?
Yes, I have a philosophy about debt. There's good debt and bad debt. Okay.
Well, what's good and what's bad?
Well, good debt builds wealth. And so when Reginald Lewis bought Beatrice Foods and became a billionaire overnight, it was because he had a relationship with Michael Milken. And Michael Milken was floating something called junk bonds, which is nothing more than debt. Mm-hmm. And so that kind of debt, if I'm going to own an apartment building or apartment complexes or buy a business, if my business is gaining 10% per year and it costs me 4%, I'm going to do that all day long. So debt that builds wealth is good. What hurts us is consumer debt.
You mean, so like, for example, because just to break it down, for those who are less well steeped in these details, you mean debt that bids well, that would be like a mortgage, for example.
Your mortgage, good. But any debt that builds wealth, any debt where I'm now going to look at, I'm bringing more in than I'm paying out. That is good debt. But bad debt is consumer debt. And the operative word is consume. I say all the time, listen, if you went on a cruise and you borrowed money to go on that cruise and you forgot what you ate on that cruise, that's not good debt. Because here's what consumer debt is. Consumer debt is very, very simple. It is saying, I don't have the money now, but I expect to get it at some point in the future. And when I get it, I will pay for something that happened in the past. That's not good debt.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we could go, especially ahead of the holiday season, we could go really down a rabbit hole on debt, but I think that's a whole other conversation today because we are right up on time. And so I really want to thank you. Can you tell us more about your book and where we can find it?
Yes. So the book is on pre-order status, Amazon.com, Barnes and Nobles, and a number of other outlets. It will be shipped out November 16th. You can reach me on Twitter. I think you guys have my Twitter handle, which is at ROGERA15 or Roger15. And I'm happy to talk to anybody one-on-one. I'm so passionate about trying to move the needle on our community. It doesn't matter to me. You reach out to me, I'll answer you. I'm happy to do whatever I can to benefit our community. And again, I can't thank you all enough for having me on tonight. This has been a tremendous opportunity for me.
Well, it's been a tremendous opportunity for us, for me to talk to you and share ideas, and also for our viewers who are seeking to learn more about how they can build intergenerational wealth and hopefully move towards being more strategic rather than tactical. And so thank you so much for spending time with us tonight. And thank you, viewers, for spending your time with us. Please watch our other MIA Media Group shows. Mondays, The Business of Black Business at 1 p.m. with Jay Reynolds. Tuesday, My Money, Your Money at 7 p.m. with yours truly. That's me, Brigette Lumpkins. Wednesday, Soul at 7 p.m. with Nikki Gellin. Thursdays, Lunch with Legacy Leaders at 12 noon with Anne-Marie Sorrell, and Flavor of South Florida at 7 p.m. with the legendary Chef Irie.